Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is with the author Ruchir Sharma. He has spent decades in the finance industry. He's a columnist for the Financial Times, and he's the author of a new book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism. We've obviously done a bunch of episodes on the realignment about capitalism and critiques of the neoliberal status quo. But what's so interesting about this book and our conversation is that he's taking the perspective that actually so many of the problems of that status quo are from not too much capitalism, but frankly, not enough. Not enough focus on markets, not enough focus on growth, not enough focus on deregulation. We're going to get into his counter critique of the critique that many folks on the show really focus on and get into the specifics. We talk about bailouts, we talk about economic productivity, we talk about economic models that countries need to face to succeed, all of those good things. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and I'd appreciate letting me know what you think in the comments. Ruchir Sharma, welcome to the Realignment.
Good to be here. Thanks so much for doing this.
I'm really excited to speak with you, especially because we've done a lot of conversations on this show in the sort of post-neoliberal side of things from that perspective. So you're in many ways acknowledging that body of work, but offering a different perspective. So the fact that you're so right into those debates, I think will make this more interesting than a conventional both sides of an issue topic. Let's start here. The first thought I had reading the book was, I think it's very important that we define what we are talking about when we talk about capitalism in the 21st century, because you begin by recounting your childhood in India. And in India, 70s, 80s, when you're discussing socialism and capitalism, you really are speaking about a really stark economic approach. When, if you look at the United States of, let's say, 2016, when Bernie Sanders is running as a democratic socialist, even his democratic socialism is not as ambitious or aggressive as, let's say, 1970s or 1980s era socialism. So just define capitalism from your perspective.
Capitalism, from my perspective, is about giving people economic freedom, that the more people free are to do and to pursue what they want, I think for me is the core principle of capitalism. And secondly, I think it's to acknowledge that, yes, capitalism will lead to greater inequality, but that inequality is fueled by meritocracy. But what becomes a problem is if the economic system leads to an inequality in opportunity. So anybody who thinks that capitalism is going to lead to an equality of outcome is misguided. But for someone who is justified in saying that capitalism should mean great economic freedom for its people and the fact that there's equality of opportunity to pursue whatever dream they want.
I guess my question to you then would be, when you think of this book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, and you think of the different, let's say, sides of these debates, what are we actually arguing about there? Because I think there are plenty of people who would say they embrace democratic socialist positions, single-payer healthcare, an expanded role of the American regulatory state. They wouldn't disagree with some parts of your characterization of what capitalism actually looks like.
Yeah, so I think that what I show in the book is that capitalism has progressively moved so far away from what its founders had in mind or anything that we even had a few decades ago, that what we have today is a very distorted form of capitalism. And I think that for most people, they try and sort of look at capitalism in a very selective way, that for some people, they look at capitalism as, in terms of how much is the government spending, what's the government share of GDP. What I try and show here is that there are so many facets of this, which is that the problem with capitalism today is the fact that the government's role in our economy has become so extensive without us quite realizing it. So you talk about regulations, for example. As I show in the book, that there are about, every year, the American government introduces 3,000 new regulations a year. And the number of regulations that it has withdrawn over this period of time is just 20. As you know, that America has the highest per capita income of lawyers in the world. And yet, in terms of, some people say that's just the combative nature of America. And yet, if you look back at it, the growth of lawyers exploded after the 1970s or so. So that's one aspect in terms of just the regulatory state and the way it's grown. Then you look at the number of bailouts in America. That today, I think this is a historical perspective which even I was surprised to learn of as I was researching this book. That right up until the 1980s, the concept of the American government bailing out any private sector company was considered heretical. Sort of like, we don't do this, we are America. There were some bailouts, obviously, in the 1930s, when the banking sector ran into trouble. But for, whatever, 300 years, there were really no bailouts. Even in the 1970s, when like any company would get into trouble, like Penn Central or whatever, the American politicians and policymakers would squirm at the thought of bailing out a private sector company. It was really in 1984 when you had the first big financial institution bailout in terms of continental Illinois that set a precedent. And since then, it's become so common with each crisis, or forget even a crisis, every time there's a minor flutter for there to be a bailout. So we've become this bailout nation now. And it's the new form of trickle down economics in a way, which is that in the 1980s, it was sort of meant to justify that if you cut taxes for the rich, it's fine because it'll help everyone else down the curve. Now, bailing out any company in America is sold to us with a similar logic. So it's this suite of actions that the government now takes, whether it's bailing out companies, regulating, spending as a share of GDP. It's gone up from 3% of the economy to 36% of the economy now. Then the role of the Fed, which is that, that if the markets get in the slightest bit of trouble, they rush to the rescue. It's about managing the business cycle in a way where even the slightest downturn is dealt with, the American cultural way of pain management now. That if you get even the slightest amount of pain, give the economy as much opiate as required to alleviate the pain without quite ever curing the problem and making the economy addicted in a way, just like America has become to an overdose of drugs. So that's what I try and do in this book, just capture the sweep of history and what's happened over the last 100 years with the government's role getting progressively larger and larger.
I'm really glad that you set the conversation in the bailout example, because if we look at the broad bipartisan critique a lot of folks would offer to the past 20, 30, 40 years of American economic policy, they would focus on bailouts as an example of something that everyone, whether you're Bernie Sanders or Rand Paul, could have something to matter with. But I guess what I would kind of push you on is say that, A, it seems that what we're then debating is not capitalism itself, but how does government respond to economic crises? And then how, of course, does the government respond to broad world events? So I think the modification I'd offer on your statement is that obviously there's a longer term history of Americans being reluctant to bail out individual companies. But if I think of two very relevant bailouts that are going to be the top of, let's say, listeners' lived experiences, they're going to be the bailouts in 2008, not only just of Wall Street, but let's say of like the American auto industry, and the bailouts that happened during the COVID pandemic. I think in both cases, what's interesting is that in those cases, aside from some specific banks, if we were going to say there was a bailout of, let's say, the automobile industry, we wouldn't say like that was a bailout of, GM. People would say that was a bailout of the auto industry. If we're looking at COVID era in the 2020s, that wasn't just a bailout of one individual company. That was a bailout of multiple sectors and industries that were shut down via government policy, faced a severe economic downturn. And then as part of a means of, let's say, arresting the financial hit companies were taking, you're offering them bailouts to navigate through that period. So I guess from your perspective then, if we understand government is responding to specific crises that affect broader industries, rather than just one specific company where there could have been a bad CEO or a bad actor or a very locally specific issue, how should we then in the 2020s understand the bailout dynamic?
Well, I think first is to acknowledge that it's become progressively larger and larger. That, like as I show in the book, that with every crisis, the impulse and the sweep of the bailouts has become larger. And then even last year, when you had the SVB, crisis, which was, for all practical purposes, a pretty rich bank, or at least a bank catering to rich depositors, the impulse then was also to bail out SVB. So I know that this sort of goes back to the topic of moral hazard, but I think that there's something more here, which is that for the average person, as they see these bailouts accumulate, they sort of sit back and say that these guys get bailed out every time they're in trouble. How much is the government there to support us when we are in trouble? So it's like a cascading action that I think that we set into motion out here. So one of the concepts I talk about in the book is this concept of risk being socialized. That we have that the kind of capitalism we have today, risk is socialized. That no one is really supposed to or allowed to fail. But as that old line goes, that capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell, which is that, okay, if you're going to bail everybody out at the slightest hint of trouble, then we're going to sort of have a situation where the creative, destructive fiber of the economy is going to be undermined. So you point out the bailouts of 2008 and like the pandemic, and as I've said, that there is no going back to the laissez-faire form of capitalism back in the 1920s or the time before that. No, that's a very different era. But there has to be a balance which is stored, which is that every time, if you're going to just keep bailing out companies at the slightest hint of trouble, and then what are the consequences of that going to be? Like in 2020, the attitude of the government was that because in 2008 we did not do enough, then we should just do stuff now indiscriminately. So they offered all sorts of relief, and a lot of that relief went to people earning more than $100,000, not to anyone who you can argue really needed it. And then it is the precedent which you set, which is that even until last year, a lot of the pandemic relief programs, such as the ERC, was still being doled out to companies. So that's what I take issue with, which is that how do you get the balance back? The government has a role to play, but how do you get the balance back between having a free economy and yet having a government that, yes, needs to play some role when markets freeze or when there's a crisis, but how do you get the balance back where today the role of the government seems to be constant, that we're almost in like an era of constant stimulus now.
I think what's really interesting about that is I then, by setting up the examples of 2008 and 2020, picked the biggest crises that the country has faced in the past 2 decades, where I think the case for government intervening to some degree is at its most obvious. That's why the Silicon Valley Bank example you raise is pretty interesting, because that wasn't a case of a global pandemic that shuts down the entire world. That wasn't a 2008 financial crisis. That was the Silicon Valley Bank example. How would you articulate what happened then in that case, why that was an indefensible approach, and how policymakers can take lessons from that example?
Well, firstly, it's the mindset here, which is that every time there is a crisis such as SVB, the fear that is raised is that if you do not bail the company out or the bank or whoever's in trouble out, you'll have another Great Depression. Every time there is even the slightest crisis, that's the fear which is raised. And my point is the fact that that's one reference point, 1929. There's a misunderstanding of what happened in the 1920s. Why did we have the Great Depression? It's partly because, and the approach of policymakers, the initial approach of policymakers when the Great Depression happened, or when the first cracks happened rather back then, was that the government should do nothing, almost that the government should play a role in liquidating it. That came from somewhere. It didn't come from, like in a vacuum. It came because in the previous downturns, including America had a bit of a mini Great Depression in 1920. The approach then was that it's not the government's business to intervene in the business cycle. And then you end up getting this, this incredible recovery in the 1920s, the roaring 1920s. And the government's hands-off approach seems to have worked in that era. And yet, by the time you get to 1929 and stuff, it's a strength taken too far. The government says, oh, we won't do anything here because of what had worked. Now, my point is we've gotten to the other extreme where every
Hmm.
single minor flutter leads to a fear that if you don't do this, you will get a Great Depression again. So where do you stop on that? Like it's become that way now. So you do a stimulus when you have a full economic recovery. You do a bailout when you have this slightest hint of trouble. Like when the SVB bailout happened, the next day on CNBC, and you had these commercial real estate people going and saying that we also need a bailout because if you don't bail us out, then all these small and medium-sized businesses and banks will get into trouble out there. So it's that cascading effect that every time you have a slight crisis, you say we're going to like have a Great Depression if we don't intervene, and yet they intervene, and there are consequences of this. People think that, but what's the negative of bailing companies out? Where is the crisis? And I say, yeah, there is not an apparent fiscal crisis or a debt crisis, but there is a much deeper insidious crisis. And what do I mean by that? Two things here. One, that the decline in productivity, that for the last so many decades that we have seen this increased amount of government intervention, productivity has been declining on a constant basis. As you know, the key to economic growth is productivity. If you keep having declining productivity, that is a real problem as far as economic growth goes. So the pie is not getting as big as it should be getting. And there's a second consequence, which is that in America today, 70% of Americans say that they are not happy with the current economic system. They want change or they want it toned down. So there is a very large population of America today which is unhappy with the way the economic system is operating and wants something to stop. They sense the unfairness of it. They sense as if the system is rigged against them. So I think that those are the two big consequences that we're already facing from this constant government support out there, with bailouts obviously being the most talked about aspect of it.
Let's take a second. Let's take off your financial hat and pretend you're in the room in these government meetings where the debates about the bailouts are actually happening. Because this is me speaking as the politician version of myself, not the podcast version of myself. If you say to me, look, Marshall, everyone in this room is telling you this bailout will prevent a Great Depression. And I'm going to tell you that actually this is much more like 1920, 21 than it is 1929. From a risk perspective, from a political perspective, I would much rather take the risk that I'm creating a moral hazard or I'm creating this longer term problem than taking that 1 to 2 to 3% risk that there will be a Great Depression. So I guess I'd be just curious and you're not a politician, so I don't expect a perfect answer, but I would just be curious, how would you articulate this point if you're sitting in the room and the SVB conversation's happening and someone is saying, look, if there's a 1% chance this is the Great Depression 2.0, that's too big of a risk. How do you think through a scenario? Because I think that's how the scenarios actually play out. How do you think through that?
So I think that's very true. So firstly, from a practical standpoint, I'd say that until the American government runs out of the capacity to rescue or to spend and to take on more debt, the current approach will continue. So therefore, I end the book by saying that the only way out is through, by just saying that unless you get an absolute crisis, there is nothing which is going to stop governments from doing what they're already doing. But I'd say that there is a second thing, that the problems are not somewhere in the distant future or in the long term. We have a current problem, as I said. The problems are twofold. One, that we have already seen productivity growth declining. So that means that you're getting less economic growth now. And the second is this, which is that most Americans today want change. They're not happy with status quo. So, we go on talking about Biden's low approval rating or the low approval ratings, and we keep linking it to immediate factors. And my point is this, which is that the approval ratings of leaders across the Western world is close to a record low today. So status quo is almost not an option. Politicians who are saying that, hey, we can't do anything else but continue with this status quo are also facing a consequence of that at the hustings, which is that they're losing most elections now, which is 2 out of 3 governments in the developed world now lose elections. 20, 30 years ago, two out of three governments in the developed world would typically win their election. So if you were an incumbent, the odds were in your favor of winning an election. Today, if you're an incumbent, the odds of you getting re-elected are, like around one third or so. So that's a big change which has taken place out there. So carrying on with the status quo and saying that I don't want to take any risk, I just want to keep doing the way things are. Okay, American people aren't happy with status quo, and you're going to face a consequence of that at the hustings.
Okay, so let's pretend that despite everything you've said, I'm president in this case. I go ahead with the Silicon Valley bailout, but afterwards I say to you, look, you lost the politics of this moment. Per your point, there's a reality here we could afford from a practical short-term perspective to bail SVB, so we bailed it out. But that said, I'm declaring as president this far, no further. What would you actually recommend then we offer up after that bailout to prevent that cycle from continuing onwards? Because my just quick thing is, as I'm talking with you, I'm realizing that part of the problem from the anti-bailout perspective is that the time to have this debate is not in the middle of the actual crisis or the actual bailout problem. And it seems to me that part of the issue is there's not a real constituency for getting the bailout politics set properly after the fact or before the fact. But let's pretend we're doing this effectively. We've bailed out SVB. What should we do moving forward to arrest this cycle?
No, I agree that I think it's about getting the balance back, which is that, for the American government to say that, listen, enough is enough. We just can't keep doing this. Instead of justifying their actions and leading to even greater sort of risk by saying that in the end, I'm going to get, like the next time a crisis come by, I'll raise the same fear that we get a Great Depression, so I'm going to do a bailout. I think that someone needs to stand up there and say this culture of bailout needs to end. Yeah, fine, we had crisis in the past. Maybe we did it, but going forward, I think exactly as you said, that someone needs to draw the line and say, hey, no more bailing out of these companies now. This has just gone too far for us. And I think that a lot of people will understand that message. I mean, I do feel that leads to a lot of resentment. The 2008 bailout of the financial system may have prevented the Great Depression because it was a severe crisis or whatever. But how many people got so annoyed with what was done then in terms of that, why were these institutions being bailed out, and the debate continues. And I think that's really the approach of government, and that's what really troubles me, which is that the same policymakers who tell you that we need to bail out companies to avoid a Great Depression have the same approach with financial markets. That when financial markets start to get bubbly, let's say, right? I mean, that they're doing very well or they're getting almost too bubbly and overvalued, the approach of these policymakers is let these good times roll on. There's nothing that we can do in terms of it because we don't know if it's a bubble or not. But the moment markets fall, even by 5, 10% or 20% or something, the impulse is, let's go rescue the markets. How could you have such an asymmetry there? When you let markets run on the upside and say, I can't do anything about it. But the moment markets fall, you rush in there with the cavalry and say, I need to rescue. And this is again something that I document in the book, that before 1987, when Greenspan famously intervened there to arrest the stock market's decline after the big crash in 87, even though there were no visible economic consequences to that, he went ahead and said that, okay, I'm going to prevent the markets from falling further here, because he was invoking 1929 again in his head, and saying that's going to happen. That's the real problem, that you're back to that same thing, which is that from that day onwards, this Greenspan put came into being, and this sort of thinking seeped in, to financial market players, that if the markets were to ever have a sudden break, the Fed would be there to always back out the financial markets. So it's that thinking which I think needs to change. And remember, this is not the way it used to be. I mean, in the past, before 87, American policymakers really wouldn't be that sensitive to stock market developments like they started being after that. And that is what's led to this socialization of risk, as I put it in the book.
Last question on bailouts before we take a bigger picture look at this issue. To your point around bailouts and how politically unpopular they are and how they really don't meet an anti-status quo moment, I would say, as someone who is an expert in politics versus you're an expert in like economics and finance, I would say if you took the full political spectrum of American politicians, the day after the SUV bailouts, they would basically not disagree with that idea that we have to say no more bailouts. This doesn't work. This is helping elites win and not helping everyday people win, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone agrees. But when you see something where everyone agrees, but you actually keep doing the thing that everyone agrees is bad, there's obviously some problem. So I'm curious from your perspective, where is the gap between everyone from AOC to Elizabeth Warren to Trump to Biden, et cetera, saying, okay, this bailout wasn't ideal, no more? Where is the gap between everyone agreeing politically and nodding their head and actually implementing the changes that need to actually exist? Is this industry capture? Is this like the people who like are actually using SVP have a disproportionate voice when an actual crisis is happening? How should we think about the failure mode here?
Well, I think the failure mode is the fact that a lot of economists and other thought leaders haven't quite thought this through. They like in terms of the fact that their approach remains very ad hoc, which is that like every time there's a crisis, we'll have to do a bailout. So it's easy to say so in a calm moment, we won't do it again. But nobody believes it because people believe the fact that the moment you end up having a crisis, all these guys are gonna relent and go back to doing what they have to do to just look at it, from a very immediate perspective. So I think that the entire issue here is the fact that, and also because so many economists out there keep telling us that okay, all this bailout has happened, but there is no real consequence of it. I think that it's underappreciating that there are consequences to this. There are consequences in terms of, as I sort of articulated, which is that there is deep resentment at this, and also the fact that it's undermining productivity and the creative destruction ability of the economy. But I think that there is that too many economists keep focusing on that. Oh, there is no cost to this, and I'm really surprised that so many liberal economists who keep favoring easy money, whether it's bailouts or saying the Fed should cut interest rates at the slightest excuse. And what they don't realize is that on one hand, they go on talking about what's the problem with the American economy, growing inequality, too much financialization, too many billionaires, and yet they don't realize that the biggest beneficiaries of these policies of bailing out or socializing risk or of letting the Fed run such easy money policies, which it has done in the past, the biggest beneficiaries of this tend to be the entrenched, tend to be oligopolies, tend to be the billionaires who are already in place and the big companies. So I think that there is this really underappreciation amongst a very influential lot about what are the consequences of these actions. And I think that they look at it in terms of very binary terms that, oh, as long as there is no crisis, all this is crying wolf, and scaremongering, that there is no crisis, like in terms of that, all these people who warned us about rising deficits and rising debt, nothing has happened. So if nothing's happened, then why should the government not just keep doing what it's doing?
Something I'd like to really bring out from the way you wrote the book is you give a great, I think, frankly, pretty nonpartisan history of various eras of development of the American economy, everything from the Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian debates to the way that mobilization related to the Civil War forces the American government to reconfigure both its role in the economy, but also monetary policy, to, of course, the period before, leading into, and after the Great Depression. Key in the way you tell that story, though, is a recognition that we can't just basically say, the goal is capitalism, because the question is, what does the economy look like? What does the global scene look like? All these factors play in together. So when you're articulating, I think from a goal perspective, if you're trying to find a better balance between these competing instincts in American history, what is a useful time period that rhymes with ours today and also doesn't reflect a, let's say, 1810s vision of a Jeffersonian America that can make us understand a more quote unquote capitalistic approach to the 2020s and the 2030s? Because I think too often when you speak to ideological libertarians, the way they tell this story is too, in their own way, they're too focused on the Great Depression. And there's not enough of an acknowledgement of the ways the country has very obviously changed.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. So in fact, the use, like we have to use history very carefully, as I sort of say, out there, which is that there's an old Russian proverb that I'd like to sort of use here, which is that you ignore history, you lose an eye, you focus on it too much, and you lose both. So the whole idea that yes, there are historical parallels, and we need to look at what's happened in history, but we also need to understand that history can guide us, but it's not something which we need to go back to. So I have a whole chapter in the book about where is capitalism working today? Where is it working? Which countries is it working in? And in terms of that, where are people happier than they are like in the United States? So I have an entire section in that chapter on specifically Switzerland, which is that it's the richest economy in the world, higher per capita income than America, and also the fact that it is happier than America on most happiness indices. And yet it seems to get the balance correct between light touch regulation, government spending as a share of GDP, taxes as a share of GDP. It seems to get the balance correct, where you have like every cantonment in Switzerland builds its own small or medium sized industry, which becomes globally competitive and exports from chocolates to Swiss knives. And then you have the big companies in the Zurich, Geneva area. So it seems to get the balance correct. And then I also document countries like Taiwan, where government spending as a share of GDP is half that nearly of America. And yet they seem to have a very good administrative state. So you don't need to throw like more money just to get a better administrative state. You can do it smartly and more efficiently, as some of these East Asian countries like Taiwan is a case in point being. And then I show that what the benefit of giving people more economic freedom can be. China used to be that way until it changed under Xi Jinping, and now in Vietnam, it's a communist country at one level. On the other hand, they're giving their people more and more economic freedom, and Vietnam, as a result, is emerging as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and its per capita income is rising explosively. So I think that these are various examples I use in the book to show where is capitalism still working in a modern day context, right? Because I think in America's history that you point out, there's no going back to the past. It's about how do you remember the past, what the benefits were of that era, and what the downside was. I think that the benefits, I've told you that when America, like in the first industrial revolution, right up until the 1920s, America would spend 40% of its time in a recession. Now, American society today is not prepared to do that, even if it leads to a much higher productivity boom. It's not going to happen. On the other hand, you need some management of the business cycle, but you need to see it in a modern context. And so, therefore, I've offered these countries. I know some people say, oh, these are small countries. I said, yeah, they may be small, but they're significant. They're among the world's, top 20 economies, such as Switzerland, and increasingly Vietnam, Taiwan are getting there. So they offer some lessons for us about how to get the balance correct, rather than us saying, oh, we're doing much better than continental Europe or even Japan or stuff. Those are not great benchmarks. They're sort of the welfare state, and the regulatory state is even more extended than ours.
So this is where I think this gets very interesting. So if we embrace, as we should, your citing of, I believe it was the New York Times Siena poll, about 70% of the American populace rejecting the status quo. And then the obvious question to ask you is basically, okay, what do you have on offer for those folks? I think the way of kind of not parroting your point of view, but basically saying what you have on offer is a deregulatory approach, a focus on debt and deficits, obviously a rebalancing away from spending, and a focus on tax cuts when it comes to spurring growth and productivity. I think the immediate reaction that a lot of folks who are in the know of these debates are going to basically have is, how is he not just describing the basic center-right approach embraced in this country since 1980. And yes, it's true, obviously, that Reagan pursued the deregulatory and the tax cuts part of that plan, but he, to his own admittance, like you cite him in the book as reluctantly admitting he didn't accomplish the debt and deficit side of things. But, the 1990s, there were debt and deficit reductions. Like that was a temporary focus area caused by both Bill Clinton's paring back his ambitions after 1994, and then Gingrich controlling Congress. But we've kind of had these sets of policy options on the table, and it doesn't feel like our country's doing any better. And actually, those policy options led to us to be so dissatisfied. So what is your response? Because I know obviously there's nuance here. What's your response to someone who holds that POV?
No, my point is that it's a misunderstanding of history. I mean, as I said, that the first cure to a problem is to recognize what's the problem. So the whole idea that Reagan or like anybody else in that so-called neoliberal era oversaw a big reduction in the regulatory state or the welfare state or in government spending is wrong. Where is the evidence for that? I mean, just look at the explosion in regulations that has taken place over the last 2 or 3 decades. As I pointed out, just look at the explosion in bailouts that's taken place in the last 2 or 3 decades. So this notion that we lived through some neoliberal era, I mean, to me is like a myth. As I have a whole chapter there, that this whole idea that we ever lived through an era of small government is a myth. Where is the evidence of a small government? Yes. Where did this impression come from that we are in this neoliberal era? I think it came from 2 or 3 fronts. One, as I point out, that there was deregulation of the financial sector, but not of small businesses or of the overall economy, where 3,000 new regulations are being introduced every year for the last couple of decades. The second impression that we were living through this neoliberal era happened because many countries outside of the developed world, like China, India, and all these countries adopted a much more free market approach after being heavily socialist or communist in their economic approach. So that led to that. And the third thing is because of globalization, that you got much more globalization, and that's what. So I think that the deregulation of financial markets, then globalization, and the fact that you had countries, adopting much more free market reforms is what led to that thing. But America itself, if you look at it in terms of its core domestic policies, this era that it ever had of small government is just a myth, or that Reagan deregulated anything apart from the financial sector, or the evidence doesn't bear it out. As I said, that concepts of bailout, concepts of Fed policymakers becoming so sensitive to stock market developments, all these have happened since the 1980s. So that's my response to that. To make capitalism work, give it a try. We're not trying it. This is what we have today is a very distorted form of capitalism.
That's fascinating. Here's what my immediate response to that would be. So 2 levels of response. So the first, we'll do them one at a time. The first level of response is, I think it's still accurate to refer to this as a neoliberal era, especially in contrast to the New Deal era, not when it comes to, let's say, what government did. And I think measuring it as you did, GDP, growth, et cetera, the overall burden of taxation, I think is helpful in illuminating. But I think it's also relevant to talk about what government didn't do. So I think someone who's on the, let's say, if you woke up a New Deal Democrat from the late 60s and said, okay, did we expand Medicare and Medicaid to the rest of the population? And when they were told no, they'd say oh, that's sort of strange. If we look back to the 4 freedoms and the history of the early Democratic Party in that post New Deal era, that was going to be the logical culmination. 2, you obviously have Bill Clinton declaring the era of big government is over. To your point, if we're measuring that purely by expenditure and GDP rates, that isn't quite accurate. But I think it's also accurate, once again, in the sense of what did we then not do? I think if you took Bill Clinton from the 1970s and said, hey, would your crowning achievement be welfare reform and NAFTA? I don't think he would say that those would represent triumphs of policy. So can you respond to maybe the narrative, what we didn't see happen? Because this is also something that the post-neoliberals basically do, which is that what they say is, that's all fair, but we had all these other things that we were going to do that the neoliberal era prevented us from doing. And then now we're getting blamed for an ineffective clutch together. We reform welfare, but we still keep taxation at its current rate. How would you think about that?
No, yeah. So I think that, is to put in perspective that we need a welfare state. We need a role of government in our society. What I try and say is that can we please prioritize this rather than the government doing everything? As a result today, that the government is running a budget deficit today, even though we have full employment of 6% of GDP. Now that's double the average of what we used to run in the last 20 years. And at that point in time, our numbers were roughly in line with the other developed countries. Today, we're running double the average, even though we have full employment. If we do end up getting a downturn, our budget deficit could get to 9 to 10% of GDP. Look at our government debt today. The government debt today has exceeded 100% and is behind that of only Japan and Italy. Hardly two great lodestars that we should be aspiring to get to. And the fact is that if we keep on this path, by the end of this decade, we'll overtake even Italy on that front. So, this is taking stuff to a totally new level in terms of the involvement that's happened, like in the economy. So, yeah, let's get our priorities correct. If we want the government to spend on the energy transition, if we want the government to spend on defense, because of the threats from China, Russia, or whatever, if we want the government to spend some on welfare, yeah, but how much are we going to keep spending on? Uh, the government today is spending on industrial policy. The government today is sort of, designing the CHIPS Acts and other acts where it's sort of directing where capital should go and not go in terms of that. And a lot of private sector companies are just piggybacking on the back of that. I have Indian business people who come to America, visit and say, isn't this what we used to do in the 1970s and 1980s? And now America's doing this about directing capital where it should go, which industry should go, which may appear smart today. But who knows what happens 5, 10 years from now, where that money may end up getting wasted if something new comes up or some new cutting edge technology comes up. So I think that it's this involvement, which is that where do we stop? How do we get the balance correct? I'm not for saying that the government should not do anything. It's about just getting this balance correct and being mindful. Because what will happen is this, that if we keep going down this path, and let's say the government, keeps going down, and if we have a crisis where we are in a situation where the government is totally out of its ability to spend, then we'll have to cut back on everything indiscriminately. Do we want to get to that crisis point where the government stops, is forced to cut everything just because it runs out of money to spend? And today we can be complacent that we have the world's reserve currency, we can keep funding our deficits, it doesn't really matter. But, like something which can't go on forever will not. If we get to 9, 10% budget deficit and our government debt to GDP gets to levels which are even higher than Italy's or something by the end of the decade, there is bound to be a day of reckoning, rather than the current approach that that we can keep down this path. It's had no visible consequences in the path, and so now we'll keep going down this path.
I want to focus on the CHIPS Act industrial policy sector because, like, my actual area of focus in terms of my day job is really the national security space. And to your Indian friends, I would say that the industrial policy approach that would be the most like a worst case scenario, 70s, 80s India, would be basically saying the following, saying, hey, we used to build things in this country. Remember the 50s, remember the 60s. We are going to spend money across industries in a very untargeted way to get manufacturing employment back to like X percentage of the population. Or we're going to spend X percent of GDP on this, or that. I'd say, though, at its best in the CHIPS Act case, the national security case is, I think, pretty direct in the sense that, like, hey, we've got 10 to 12% of the global semiconductor share. We're overly dependent on Taiwan, which has very serious geopolitical implications. We're obviously not going to wake up in America where we've reshored semiconductor manufacturing back to what it was in the 70s or 80s, but we really need to get from 12% to 20%. I think from my perspective, that's pretty reasonable. And obviously, like, the rhetoric gets a bit overheated when it comes to that, I think, as part of the means of selling the bill. But I actually think when you talk to NatSec experts, the goal of getting from 12% to 20% is actually pretty reasonable. So I'd be curious how you respond to, like, the directed example, not of like Foxconn during Trump, not of like 70s, 80s India, but the very specific, like, hey, we can't have 90% share owed to Taiwan. That's a geopolitical disaster. How would you think about that example?
Yeah, so I think that this is the problem, and this, echoes the discussion we had about the bailout, that on an individual basis, everything can be justified. right? So, like, let's do industrial policy, let's do welfare policies, let's do defense policies. We're facing these threats from there. Let's do green transition policies. On an individual basis, each one can be justified. But you take the cumulative effect. Okay, like you point out to the 1950s, Eisenhower, whatever, like era. That time, government spending as a share of GDP was nowhere close to where we are today. So, in terms of that, fine, if we were doing something then, we were not doing a lot of other things also then, in terms of the scope of the welfare policies or other things that we have. So, how can we keep doing everything? So, and then again, where do we stop? So, if we want to be like the 1950s and 60s, then let's go and follow those policies in full, not by just cherry picking that worked. Then fine, if that worked there are five things that we are doing today, including green transition and stuff, which we didn't have to do back then. So we just need to get the priorities correct and say, okay, we're going to do this and that. And as I said, that the thing about this book, I mean, which I've tried to say, is that I'm not coming from any ideological perspective here. All I'm trying to say is that something has gone wrong with this model of capitalism that we have, where a lot of people are disillusioned with it. And some people, just want more government action to deal with it. And I'm trying to say, but just this accumulation of government action that we've seen over time is what's got us into this state. So let's wake up, realize as to what's got us here before we keep rolling down this path.
I'm a very pragmatic person, so I really appreciate the way you just framed that. So then let's give a model, because I was laughing when you said, look, obviously because once again I work in the DC policy scene, so I really take seriously your point that the way the policy process actually works is that, like, let's say you're talking about the National Security Council. There are people on the NSC who work on green transition issues, aka the people who are pushing competition with China regarding like EV batteries. They can, on an individual basis, give like a perfectly defensible case for why they're doing that in this case. Same things for like the NatSec hawks who focus on semiconductors like me. So if we have a situation where every single constituency is going to be able to present a coherent case for what they do, how do you suggest through as a country, like looking at this country today, how do we come up with a process or a rubric for understanding how do we, I don't want to say pick, because I'm not asking you to pick and choose between these between these five categories. How do we think through needing to prioritize, needing to understand, like, okay, so maybe from my perspective, I think that if we're looking at it, if let's say we only have two choices, I think semiconductor manufacturing is far more important than like the green transition. Just in terms of like gun to the head, Taiwan 2027, we have to choose there, but that's not quite how policy works. So just how do you think about prioritizing and thinking things through?
Yeah, I think this is where leadership comes into place, because that someone's got to have the strong leadership of saying this is my priority today. Like, at least you're willing to take a stance here, which is that, but boy, if like, as you know how this country would react if you were to sort of go out there and say, I prefer semiconductors over green energy transition. I mean, that will, I will get you a lot of feedback online, I'm sure. So I think that's the point, which is that that the reaction could be so sharp against these things, but that's where leadership comes in to explain to people what works and what doesn't work out there. And I think that's what we are totally missing out here today. So therefore, everything is supposed to be spent. I mean, even someone like Donald Trump came there, and you think that he's going to be conservative and stuff, and he talks the big game on cutting regulations and stuff like that. Nothing gets done in like Washington. You still have more and more regulations that get implemented by the time his term ends. So I think it's a total absence of leadership, and it's so easy for everyone to say, okay, let's do this also, let's do that also. That's the problem. And because we are in such a hostile environment, that if you were to say no to something, it would lead to massive pushback. So I sympathize with that. But my thing is this exactly, that let's prioritize in terms of what we can do, or the sad situation is going to be, which is that we're running 6% budget deficits. Today will be 8 to 9%. Like next time, like there's a downturn, and then we will not have the choice to prioritize. We'll be told that you're going to cut everything. And I've seen that coming. We are far away from being any emerging market or other places, but I've seen those countries that once they run into a crisis, then they're forced to cut everything, including welfare spending. And that'll be a sad moment if we ever get to such a state.
I think that's so we're nearing the end here, but I think a couple points I want to pull out. So I think that's a very important I think, addition to the policy conversation, because what I'm hearing from you here is if we're diagnosing the policy and economic process in this country, it's that both sides of the aisle are effectively behaving as if there are limitless options in front of them.
Yes.
But your point is, in the medium to long term, and frankly, that medium to long term is shrinking increasingly. It's long term if we're talking about the 2000s. It's not long term if we're talking about the year 2024. The limitless policy options in front of us period is really shrinking. So that's a message that policymakers need to internalize, because the point is there's a political limit, and I think that's what I think what the post neoliberals are really good at is focusing on the nature of the difference between an economic limit and a political limit. So the example they always like to cite, I brought a Bernie Sanders staffer on who worked on the child tax credit expansion. And his point was like, look, in the year 2022, we halved child poverty because we just rapidly increased the size of the child tax credit. We always could have done that. That was always a possibility, but we didn't do it because we thought there'd be political backlash. And I think that's an example of, I think, focusing on a politically imposed limit, which is different than an economic one. I think your point is that we're going to enter into a political environment where not only will the political options be actually shortened and like decreased, but there will actually be a financially, economically focused limit on our ability to do something like CTC expansion. Is this a fair way of articulating the point you're making here?
Yes. I think that's a fair way. But I mean, I also want to, so you have perfectly articulated that. But the point I'm also making is the fact that there have already been consequences to all these actions in terms of declining productivity, declining approval ratings of leaders, a disaffection with the economic system. Those consequences have already happened. So let's just recognize that there have already been negative consequences of these actions. And two, from a very policy perspective, as you say, that if we keep going down this path, then the consequences will become more visible and force us to take actions which are more distasteful. I think that's the way that I characterize this.
So for the final question here, because I think reading the book, speaking of, I think the hardest point to articulate from your side of these issues is the vision question. Because I think for most casual listeners, readers, et cetera, they're going to attribute your vision to whatever's happened over the past 30 years, because they're going to say, look, we're in the era of Reaganism, we're in the era of big government being over. So any dissatisfaction with the status quo is basically a result of deregulation, talking about austerity politics, tax cuts, et cetera. What is just like your clean 2024 vision for what we could experience as a country if we focused on growth, productivity, any other metrics that you think we really need to be focusing on at a policymaking level?
No, as I said, that why I like I've written this book, and it's my most ambitious project here, and it was really like a pandemic baby. It's in the pandemic when we did this.
Wait, can I pause there real quick? You wrote a book on like the 10 rules for nations succeeding. Yes. So you describing this as more ambitious than that is like fascinating. Yeah, that was just a side note, but sorry, go on.
It's because I think that I've taken a long history here and I've tried to sort of tell people about the fact that what's gone wrong with capitalism. And I think it's a very top of the mind question, for people, right? In terms of that, you can write a 10 rules successful nations book, which I love doing, but that is still something which is about observational, about, okay, how do you predict which countries will rise and fall? That'll happen. This is about talking about a problem which I think is much more relatable to many people, right? I mean, every person is thinking about this issue. So I was very taken aback by the kind of response I got just to the title. Like the moment you mentioned the title, it's like, yeah, we want to talk about this topic. So like in terms of that, you're going to a topic which is at the heart of most people. So I think that what I'm trying to do here in the book is to like illustrate what has happened and to also bust these myths that give me the evidence of this smaller state. Give me the evidence of the fact that that we had a lot of deregulation across the economy, and so I'm trying to present in a way an alternative history, or like really retelling history and trying to clarify these myths based on a very data approach. So I've approached it really from using data to back this up rather than some ideological argument here.
It's very helpful. This has been a great conversation. The book, for listeners is available now. It's What Went Wrong with Capitalism. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment.
Thanks a lot. Enjoyed that.